So,
Welcome to our Bible Colloquy with Dr. Greg Carey. Today's lecture is titled, Did Jesus Spin Open-Ended Parables? And So What? Dr. Greg Carey is professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. Today's moderator and host is Dr. Sam Adams, professor of Old Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Adams, the floor is yours.
well, thanks, and want to welcome everybody to this special webinar. Because of the topic and our engaging speaker, we decided that we would have this Bible department event in the evening to allow as many friends of the seminary as possible to attend. And so I'm glad that so many folks were able to do so. Certainly encourage you as Dr. Carey speaks to type questions into the chat. As they come to you, I will continue to sort of collate those, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. And so you don't need to wait until the end to do that. It is my special privilege to welcome Dr. Carey here. Greg has taught at Lancaster Seminary since 1999. He is a well-known New Testament scholar, did his doctoral work at Vanderbilt. He is very interested in the book of Revelation, in the Gospel of Luke, in apocalyptic literature, which are topics that are of interest to both our New Testament faculty and Old Testament faculty here at Union. He also uses his voice in important ways for public biblical interpretation. He's written or edited over 9 books, and his latest book is Using Our Outside Voice, Public Biblical Interpretation, Stories Jesus Told, How to Read a Parable. And so some of what he's talking about will dovetail with that book, certainly. I also just want to express my appreciation to Greg, and I will make it available, or you can find it through Outlet, to anybody who would like to see it. One of our most downloaded essays. I get a report every year as editor of interpretation. One of our most downloaded essays of the last decade for the journal Interpretation was from our issue on the book of Daniel. Dr. Carey wrote an essay on Daniel, and he talked about VeggieTales. And I know many of you know the way in which VeggieTales sanitizes, cleans up, and changes the really powerful message against oppression and hierarchy in Daniel in a way that and Greg really does some really interesting and I think excellent commentary on some of the downsides of the VeggieTaleization sometimes of biblical stories. So I have talked enough. So I want to turn it over to Dr. Carey. We had him scheduled a year ago to give a talk at the seminary, and unfortunately, that talk was scheduled right as the seminary was locking down, and so regretfully, we were not able to have him. Everyone was really looking forward to that. So it's wonderful, like, pretty much exactly a year later, to be welcoming him back. And so, Greg, we're excited about this talk. Did Jesus spin open-ended parables, and so what? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sam, for this invitation and for that introduction. I've been looking forward to this for a while, and it is an honor, especially to speak to the Union community. I lived in Richmond in the late 80s, straight out of college, and Union let me use the library and roam around while I was theologically curious. So I know the heritage of the seminary and very much admire my faculty colleagues there in my field, not all of whom I know personally, but whose work I know. And so I'm just filled with joy to be having this talk tonight with you all. This presentation brings together 3 questions or problems that fascinate me. I hope they will you. The first is, did Jesus use open-ended parables? that, in the words of C.H. Dodd, would tease the mind into active thought. In other words, did he tell parables that made his hearers or make us readers part of the process of constructing meaning? That question leads into a second one. I want to answer that first question with a complicated yes, but the second involves Nazis. Simply, have our ways of talking about Jesus' parables been influenced by the Nazi aesthetics of Martin Heidegger? And if so, what do we do about that? And then the third question involves the relationship between the parables as we encounter them in the Gospels and Jesus himself. Interpreters have celebrated the parables as the most distinctive aspect of Jesus' teaching, but anyone who's taught the parables over time recognizes that very often we're not just teaching the parables, but we're teaching the literary artistry, in particular of Matthew and Luke, but sometimes Mark. How do the parables, as we encounter them in the Gospels, relate to Jesus? Now, that may seem like some moving parts for one presentation, but I believe the three problems are closely related, or they are to me, and I hope to provide a unified response that makes historical sense, ethical sense, and theological sense. And I'll warn you, if you'd like to have your Bible handy, that I'll be referring to two parables, the dishonest manager in Luke 16 and the laborers in the vineyard in Matthew 20. So I'd like to begin by going way back in time to a German New Testament scholar named Ernst Lohmeyer. Lohmeyer did not like the Nazis. He participated in the Confessing Church's anti-Nazi resistance. He defended Jews from Nazi persecution. He wrote explicitly about how Christianity depends on Judaism for its core identity. And he defended the academic independence of German universities. So for all those reasons, the Nazis persecuted Lohmeyer. First, they demoted him from one university position to a later position. Then, when he was 49 years old, during World War II, they sent him to fight on the Eastern Front. He barely survived. And finally, after the war, on the night before he was going to be inaugurated as president of the University of Greifswald, the Soviet-controlled German authorities arrested Lohmeyer. Months later, they executed him in secret, and they tried to erase him from memory. But a recent book by a New Testament scholar named James Edwards documents Lohmeyer's personal and professional development and unearths that sort of secret history of how he came to be arrested and eventually executed. Lohmeyer expressed his solidarity with Jews and Judaism at great risk to himself. In 1933, Gerhard Kittel, if you're as old as I am and into the Bible, you know Kittel's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. In 1933, Kittel gave a public address called The Jewish Question, which was published the following year. And in this address, Kittel wrote that Jews who had converted to Christianity, he described them as my Christian brother, but not my German brother. Kittel held that Germans should segregate Jews into ghettos and remove Jews from important public positions in order to protect the German Volk. He was so arrogant that he wrote a personal letter to the Jewish intellectual Martin Buber, asking Buber to understand that in his argument, he was expressing his intellectual integrity. Buber was brave enough to publish a critique of Kittel's lecture, and then Lohmeyer wrote to Buber. And in this letter, Lohmeyer advanced a highly problematic two-dimensional claim. I hope that you'll be in agreement with me in this, he wrote, that the Christian faith is Christian only insofar as it bears the Jewish faith in its heart. I do not know if you'll be able to affirm the reverse, that the Jewish faith is Jewish, only insofar as it preserves within itself a place for the Christian faith. Let us acknowledge Lohmeyer's courage and goodwill. Although he couldn't see the future, he directly perceived the anti-Semitic threat that Nazism provided. He spoke seriously about it and openly about it. And yet, when he reached out to Buber and could affirm Christianity's dependence on Judaism, at the same time, he wanted Buber to acknowledge that somehow Judaism needed Christianity. People are complicated, and a lot of us have our own limitations of how we were raised and don't quite get past them. But what does it mean for a Christian to assert that Judaism is only Jewish insofar as it leaves room for Christianity? Throughout the centuries, Christians have been plagued by those among us, most of the time, who insist that Judaism is somehow deficient or inferior, and that position has borne toxic fruit on a global scale. A very recent study by David Horrell demonstrates that those tropes still dominate the interpretation of Paul. Going back in time, theologians like J. Cameron Carter and Willie James Jennings attribute the emergence of Western racism to these anti-Jewish dimensions of Christian teaching. And Lohmeyer was trying to do the right thing. And at the same time, he showed the limitations of his era. Edwards' biography elevates Lohmeyer's also overlooked scholarly contributions. And although Edwards discusses Lohmeyer on the parables only briefly, it turns out that Lohmeyer stood out in his historical context and anticipated major developments in 20th century scholarship. Lohmeyer saw the parables as, quote, Jesus' most distinctive speech form, with no parallel in Judaism or other traditions of Jesus' day. He perceived the parables as the unique way in which Jesus engaged his hearers with the mystery of the kingdom of God and with Jesus calling upon them. His views anticipate those later articulated by figures as great as C.H. Dodd and John Dominic Crossan. Now, Jesus' parables are familiar to many of us. If we've been in church much, as soon as we hear Good Samaritan, Prodigal Son, Rich Man and Lazarus, Laborers in the Vineyard, we can recite the basic storyline. But Lohmeyer's interpretation of these parables stood out in his day. He had inherited a tradition of parable interpretation that argued that a parable had only one meaning. And the job of the interpreter was, like a surgeon, to cut out everything from the parable to arrive at that one core teaching that would always concern the kingdom of God. Lohmeyer broke the pattern by emphasizing how the parables engage their hearers. His contemporary C.H. Dodd never cites Lohmeyer. I don't know if he was aware of Lohmeyer's work. But Dodd, at about the same time, argued that parables are distinguished by their vividness or strangeness in such a way as to, quote, tease the mind into active thought. Later, English-speaking Anglophone scholars almost never cite Lohmeyer, probably because he wrote in German, and his comments on the parables arrive in his commentaries rather than in studies devoted to the parables. But they still tend to discuss this aspect of the parables as open-ended, oriented toward audience engagement. John Meyer, who's suspicious that we can trace many of the parables at all to Jesus himself, still uses the language Dodd used that sounds a lot like Lohmeyer to describe them. He writes that the parables are, quote, meant to be puzzling enough to tease the mind into active thought and personal decision. Many interpreters today, like Lohmeyer, commonly describe the unique, creative, or unmistakable quality of Jesus' parables. Dodd doesn't argue that Jesus' parables were unique, but he argues that they bear the stamp of a highly original mind. He wrote that certainly There's no part of the gospel record which has, for the hearer, a clearer ring of authenticity. Klein Snodgrass, whose massive commentary on the parables is a primary point of reference today, notes that many ancient cultures used parables and that the forms Jesus used were not new, but, quote, if parabolic thinking is present in all cultures, as far as we know, no one prior to Jesus used parables as consistently, creatively, and effectively as he did. And Reuben Zimmerman describes the absolutely unmistakable character of Jesus' parables as their incomprehensibility. The uniqueness of Jesus' parables stands as a commonplace in biblical interpretation today. So we're grappling with two claims that are supported by a common assumption. The first claim is that Jesus' parables have an unfinished quality. They engage their audiences in the construction of meaning. This is largely a claim about aesthetics, something interpreters celebrate about Jesus' parables. The second involves history, that although Jesus' parables have antecedents, that unfinished quality makes them distinctive. As common as they are, both of those claims now face intense criticism, and on very different grounds. First, some interpreters argue that only a few of the gospel parables can likely be traced back to Jesus himself. And second, some argue that the celebration of Jesus' indeterminate parables participates in a dangerous cultural legacy. I mentioned John Meyer before, who is a leader in the quest for a historical Jesus, who argues that no more than 4 of the gospel parables attributed to Jesus can confidently be traced back to him. And Meyer is hardly a radical scholar. He's very conservative in his methodology. But he argues that all of the parables, apart from those 4, bear the signs of later Christian usage and interpretation. As for the ethical problem, Sean Kelly critiques the view of Jesus' parables as open-ended and as unique by tracing the origins of that argument to the Nazi aesthetics of Martin Heidegger. In particular, by comparing Jesus' parables to those of the rabbis, scholars participate in a web of anti-Semitic comparisons. According to this script, Jesus comes off as more creative and less formulaic than do his Israelite antecedents and his Jewish contemporaries. And yet this presentation, I'm going to argue for both of those claims, that Jesus probably did tell distinctive and somewhat open-ended parables. I acknowledge the strength of the position that disputes the likelihood we can trace the parables back to Jesus, but I have something to say about that. At the same time that I'm very concerned about the pernicious character of anti-Semitic discourse and want to grapple with the implications of the argument that Jesus' parables were open-ended. So we'll engage both of those questions. But I'd like to begin first by surveying the reasons Kelly is concerned about Nazi influence in modern parable interpretation. Far too few interpreters of the parables have acknowledged Kelly's argument concerning Nazi aesthetics. In part, I'm doing this piece to call attention to Kelly's work among biblical scholars. It was published over 15 years ago, and yet it's rarely cited. According to Kelly, important scholars who celebrate the indeterminate or open nature of Jesus' parables bear a genealogical dependence upon the aesthetics of Martin Heidegger. We now know that Heidegger was a Nazi, and his aesthetics contribute to the notion of a distinctive and superior Aryan Volk. What makes Kelly's critique really have punch is that parable scholarship took a sharp turn in the 1960s and 70s, the very moment when English-speaking biblical scholars were deeply engaged with the work of Rudolf Bultmann, who was a friend of Heidegger's, and whose biblical hermeneutics depended heavily on Heidegger. As for Bultmann, after World War II, he and several colleagues reached out to Heidegger to ask Heidegger to renounce Nazism, and Heidegger did not. Kelly brings receipts. He demonstrates how existentialist aesthetics shape the parable interpretation of scholars as influential as Amos Wilder, Robert Funk, and John Dominic Crossan. Crossan explicitly condemns anti-Semitism. I assume Wilder and Funk would have too. So did Lohmeyer, right? And yet, however their intentions may have been meritorious, Kelly brings out telltale quotations. So I'll just share three. From Wilder, generations live in language as a habitat in which they are born and die. The language of a people is its fate. Thus, the poets or seers who purify the language of the tribe are truly world makers. Funk. Rabbinic interpretation of the law sought to engage the Jew, but ended by disengaging him from reality. Jesus attempted nothing else than to shatter the whole tradition that had obscured the law, to put it in a way that is still enigmatic, but in the way parables suggest, Jesus had to interpret the law in parable. And Crossan. This is not an attempt to exalt Jesus above the rabbis as an exercise in Christian chauvinism. It is to insist that they are doing completely different things. The rabbi stories are didactic figures. Those of Jesus, poetic metaphors. Theirs are subservient to the teaching situations. Those of Jesus are subservient only to the experienced revelation which seeks to articulate its presence in, by, and through them. It is neither necessary nor advisable to turn difference into hierarchical order. The impression's chilling. Wilder credits language with forming a people, essentially a folk, and Jesus purifies the language of his people. For Funk, parables shatter Jesus' own tradition. And Crossan, trying hard as he can not to exalt Jesus above the rabbis, interprets the rabbis' parables as bound by time and circumstance, while Jesus serves only his own immediate and presumably timeless and universal revelation. At the risk of overindulging in scholarly jargon, yikes. So let's turn to our two case studies, the parable of the dishonest manager and that of the laborers in the vineyard. Both parables show signs of heavy redactional activity, yet both maintain the image of Jesus, the teller of open-ended parables. Luke's parable of the dishonest manager reflects Luke's distinctive literary touch in several ways, along with what might be some clumsy redaction, a reality that's led many researchers to propose that there's this vexing core parable that has been tamed. Lots of commentators use that word, tamed, by Luke. Matthew's parable of the laborers in the vineyard works differently. It is precisely Matthew's literary crafting that provokes the sharpest challenge to readers. With these parables, we cannot pull apart Jesus' authentic words or the original structure of the parable from the processes of tradition and redaction as our predecessors sought to do. But these two parables provide lots to chew on, including a perduring sense of Jesus as a teacher who provoked his audiences to reflection. Then we need to discern how to respond to that probability. So the manager, Luke 16, 1 through 13. The parable of the manager vexes interpreters for two main reasons. First, the story has a hero who's a scoundrel, and interpreters scramble to identify what about this person is valuable to Jesus' readers. The most common line of interpretation holds that even a corrupt person who is too weak to dig and too proud to beg recognizes the moment for decisive action and uses material wealth appropriately. Second, critics may debate what actually belongs to the parable and what's been added to it. Does verse 8 belong to the parable itself, or is it a later addition? Is verse 9 an interpretation of the parable that goes back to Jesus? Dodd called verses 9 through 13, where he described them as looking like the notes for 3 or 4 different sermons tacked on to the end of the parable. Predictably, many interpreters argue that Luke, who's fond of either explaining parables explicitly or by placing them in a narrative setting that tells us how to interpret them, that Luke has done that to this parable and made a wild thing safe. The parable of the manager is followed by the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Those two are briefly separated by a discussion that critiques the Pharisees as lovers of money. And so one can readily discern Luke building a unit in which possessions are a primary point of emphasis. But it's not as simple as cutting Luke's setting and additions from the parable. Apart from these possibly attached interpretations, the parable itself, woven into its very core, are 3 of Luke's most distinctive literary practices. First, the parable is one of Luke's crisis parables, one of the stories in which a character starts out with relative security and relative advantage, and then boom, a crisis comes in which everything is upended for that character. Critics may not agree on every example, but we might include the manager alongside other crisis parables like the Good Samaritan, the rich fool, the prodigal, the rich man and Lazarus, and the dishonest judge. Second, the audience is privy to the manager's interior monologue, a distinctive Lucan device, where in the case of the manager, he realizes what his challenge is. He's about to lose his job, and he says, what am I going to do now that my position's been taken away from me? I know what I'll do. I'm too weak to dig, too proud to beg, but I can go to the debtors and rearrange this stuff. Only Luke has this device in its parables among the Gospels. And third, the parable reflects Luke's pervasive interest in possessions and in rich people. Luke has 3 parables that begin, there was a certain rich man. For these reasons, although I'm inclined to imagine an authentic parable of Jesus in this instance, you can imagine the evidence is far from clear. Luke's fingerprints are everywhere in this parable. So contrary to the majority opinion, the parable of the dishonest manager provides an instance in which we cannot neatly excise Jesus' creative voice from Luke's redaction and composition. The second case is the parable of the laborers, Matthew 20, 1-16. Most commentators regard this parable as more straightforward. It's strange that a landowner would begin a day without a clear plan for acquiring labor and go out to hire workers at different parts of the day. And it's remarkable that the landowner would pay every worker the same wage, whether the worker has worked a full day or just an hour. But when the laborers who work all day complain that they should have received more payment than those who have worked less, the apparent point becomes clear. The landowner attributes this remarkable pay scale to his own virtue, his goodness or generosity. Whether readers are inclined to map the parable onto spiritual benefits or material relations, they typically see the parable as a celebration of divine goodness. God's justice is not like our justice. Snodgrass identifies the workers' equal pay as, quote, the very point of the parable. So conventional wisdom places God's goodness at the center of the parable, and that leaves ample room for us still to debate what the parable means. Some interpreters follow what I call the grace option, according to which the parable is about salvation going to all people apart from their relative merit. And others follow what I might call the justice option, where they take the realities of economics and labor seriously and argue that in the reign of God, everyone receives all that they need. Everybody gets enough payment for the day. They might even, like Snodgrass, apply the parable to its narrative setting in Matthew as a warning against disciples who might be prone to be envious of one another. But all of these interpretations really land on the issue of the landowner's goodness. But interpreters generally regard the parable's conclusion, verse 16, with suspicion. So the last will be first and the first last. If we read the parable according to the equal treatment the laborers receive, this conclusion seems like an awkward fit, maybe a redactional addition. And sure enough, the parable follows a passage that ends the very verse before the parable begins with a very similar sentence. Peter has sought affirmation because because he and his colleagues have made great sacrifices to follow Jesus. And Jesus concludes his response, but many who will be first will be last, and the last first. Perhaps because we're so accustomed to cutting out redaction from the parables, commentators usually minimize the significance of one detail. The vineyard owner demands that the workers receive pay in reverse order, those hired last being paid first. Or another way to put it, those who have worked all day waiting and watching while others get paid before they do. And some commentators argue that, well, that's just not a big deal. It's necessary for the parable to work. How can some workers complain if they haven't seen the other workers get paid first? But this is, in my opinion, where the parable grows most interesting. If indeed Jesus' parables begin with ordinary situations, and many, maybe not all of them, at some point jump the tracks of normality, this detail plays that role in the parable. We can't tell whether the sequence of payment derives from Jesus or is redactional, but when we minimize its significance, we completely ignore the literary structure Matthew, not Jesus, has imposed upon the text. The reversal of first and last frames the parable at its beginning and its ending. And right in the very middle, verse 8 out of 16, the order of payment reinforces the reversal motif. Right in the middle. Matthew's telling of the parable is far more provocative than our interpretations are. Matthew's framework does not underscore God's goodness or generosity to everyone. On the contrary, Matthew brings forward a reversal of status, a concept the Beatitudes remind us that is scarcely foreign to Matthew. I would argue that there's a massive gap between reversal and equality. Some interpreters may believe Jesus' parable is challenging but fairly straightforward. The author of Matthew apparently didn't, leaving readers to ponder a world in which being first means finishing last. Both these case studies stand out among the most open-ended, provocative of Jesus' parables. But conventional attempts to separate redaction from Jesus' own creativity flounder. Instead, we have a situation in which the authors of Matthew and Luke use their literary artistry to promote the image of Jesus as a provocative spinner of open-ended parables. Rather than taming Jesus' stories, Matthew and Luke perpetuate the ways, I believe, that early Christians remembered Jesus. Jens Schroeder argues for, quote, a continuity of the remembering of Jesus through which the center aspects of his impact were clarified. In other words, Jesus was remembered in broad general strokes, and those ways of remembering the impression he made as early Christianity developed over time, become more and more clear rather than less. This memory-oriented approach would observe that early Christians consistently depicted Jesus as a teller of parables, with independent traditions attested in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Thomas. If we can't specify which parables go back to Jesus and in what form, we still, I would argue, have good reason for believing his parables made an impression on his followers, an impression that comes through in later literary developments. So I've suggested that these two parables complicate any neat distinction between Jesus, the provocative parable spinner, and less creative gospel authors. But they do advance our understanding of Jesus. Not only did Christian literary activity characterize Jesus as a parable teller, it presupposes, it underscores the capacity of the parables to tease the mind into active thought. We don't have time to pursue this, but I would argue some parallel things are going on in Thomas and even in John, which has no parables, but presents Jesus as constantly elusive in his communication. It's no wonder that the journalist Adam Gopnik, not a biblical scholar, but a really good reader, characterizes Jesus as a person of, quote, intelligence, short temper, and an ironic dueling wit, whose pet style blends the epigrammatic with the enigmatic. Were Jesus' parables unique, particularly in comparison with what we know as cultural context? I would just note two things. Not all of the parables are so open-ended. Some look like allegories, and in the Gospels come with their interpretations attached. And we have seen that Luke is notorious for explaining parables and putting them in certain contexts. We could also say that some of the parables from Jewish tradition are more open-ended than experts might tend to recognize. The most frequently cited example of that is Nathan approaching David after his abduction of Bathsheba and murder of Uriah. And Nathan tells the parable of the rich man and the lamb. And before Nathan even points the finger and says, "You're the man," David has already done his own act of interpretation, right? He judges the villain of the parable as worthy of death. Claims of uniqueness are subjective, and yet I remain convinced that the open-endedness of some gospel parables remains distinctive within their cultural context. And that then opens the question of how claims to Jesus' distinctiveness relate to anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, and even racist discourses. A great deal of parable interpretation has been shaped by anti-Jewish polemic. Either interpreters contrast Jesus' parables over against the perceived faults of ancient Judaism, in doing so perpetuating historical inaccuracies, or in some cases they adopt interpretations that identify the parables themselves as critiques of Judaism. The parable of the laborers of the vineyard has been used that way, in which it's thought that the workers who start early in the day represent Judaism, and those who come later are Gentile converts to the Jesus movement. And note that in the parable, it's those early workers who are doing the complaining. Last first and first last indeed. The dilemma I encounter involves a commitment to resist anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, a commitment to historiographical accountability as opposed to doing exegesis as a form of apologetics, and a conclusion that Jesus actually did use parables in a distinctive way, often bidding his audiences to construe their own conclusions. I encountered first this basic understanding of Jesus' parables precisely through the scholar's critique by Sean Kelly. And I might look for other ways of framing it to avoid Heidegger's murderous legacy. I might look to a scholar like Umberto Eco, the philosopher, literary theorist, who described the open work as a celebration of literary works that by design require finishing by their audiences. In the end, however, I'm left with the categories I've inherited and the problems that are entailed by them. And I imagine I'm not alone. So thank you for this opportunity to talk with you. I welcome the conversation that follows.
Thanks very much, Greg. We do have a large gathering of folks, and would encourage once again. We have a bunch of people who have just given you greetings. I think you can see in the chat, and even some comments on your natty attire this evening. So you obviously are among friends, and we're glad you're here. I do know that. I'm curious to get, as a lot of people here gathered know, we just had John Carroll join us, my colleague in New Testament. John Carroll has written a commentary on Luke, and I'll be very curious to get for the New Testament library. I'm very curious to get his take on this, and always been interested in the dishonest manager. I would like to ask an immediate question. Just to pick up, and then I can turn it over to John, and then we can open it up to some larger conversation. But as you know, just sort of the last sort of three things you cited: resisting anti-Judaism, acknowledging historical accountability, and speaking about. But the last piece of speaking about sort of the creativity of parables. Is there an extent either for the interpreter, whether he or she be a preacher or a commentator, is there a risk that in emphasizing point 3, the creativity of the parables, that we always are at risk of implicit anti-Judaism because we are speaking of uniqueness, and that oftentimes the next sentence, wherever we go with it, is by definition, going to be a confessional move that has some danger to it, and that we have to be. And so, I guess one question would be: what kind of self-monitoring do we need to engage in to make sure that we're attentive to points 1 and 2 about resisting anti-Judaism and historical accountability, even as we insist on creativity? And then I have a related question to that. Is it become time in our preaching and teaching to be much more careful about how we talk about the Pharisees, and to not make them the boogeyman that they often are? That is a dangerous and historically inaccurate move.
What a question! What a set of questions. May I start by saying hello to Professor Carroll? It's a pleasure to see you. Not that it's not intimidating. But it's a pleasure to see you. Why don't I start with the issue of the Pharisees? We spend a lot of time in our classes at Lancaster working with students on speaking about Judaism. The image I like to use is, imagine the rabbi is sitting in the front row. You're going to say that today, because so often, well, first of all, we know a lot less about Pharisees than scholars thought they did 50 years ago in some ways, more in others. And so, preachers who say these things about the Pharisees are responding to the way the Gospels describe them. That's true, but without any historical expertise to back that up. And so I think, yes, it is far past time for those of us who do biblical scholarship, those of us who preach and teach in the church, to correct the record, and might be able to go on about that in terms of how we might do it. When you asked about, emphasizing this open-ended, unique quality of the parables in the context of being concerned about anti-Judaism and historical accuracy, what I think motivated me in doing this work is I don't want to lose that open-ended part. And so part of my own story is I was a Southern Baptist high school convert who got called to preach almost immediately and can't stop thinking like a preacher sometimes when I'm thinking about these things. And so, you know, when I think about preachers in particular, if we think the parables are meant to bring hearers and readers into the process of making meaning out of the parables, that's going to have implications for how we preach the parables, right? We're going to find a preaching voice that is inviting, that isn't talking about, but is talking alongside a congregation. And for me, that's worth holding on to. I don't need to say as much about unique. I certainly wouldn't get in the pulpit and, you know, Jesus was unique, nobody was like him, and make that move. But without imagining that open quality of the parables, that has profound implications for how we would do education, and how we would do teaching. I don't want to lose that.
Thanks. I do. We have another esteemed Luke scholar in our midst and on the in the show, as they say on StreamYard. So I'm handing the baseball to you, Dr. Carroll, if you want to respond a bit and engage. And then we have some other questions coming in, but turn it over to you at this point. You got to unmute.
Still not hearing.
We're not hearing you, John. Not yet. Maybe take your headphones out. I don't know. Will that help? All right. Well, I tell you what. While John may be, yeah, we're not. There is a question up, Greg, that says, "Did Jesus tell stories that invited listeners to help construct meaning?"
That's what I'm arguing. I'm not suggesting that Jesus would have told parables in a way in which any understanding would go, but that the parables create space to say, well, what does that mean? How is the kingdom of God anything like a world in which first is last? You know, we could imagine what that means in sort of an economic revolution, and that doesn't seem exactly what Jesus has in mind. Most of us, for example, do fine imagining equality and thinking that's a value that, you know, we might agree or disagree, but we get it. First and last, there's no way to engage that without having to process it with our imaginations, maybe even in community. And I'm not remembering the scholar where I first encountered this image, but, you know, we encounter the parables in a text, often just reading the Bible alone. But if you could imagine Jesus actually telling parables, you would know there's a group of people around. There's going to be noise. There are going to be people cutting their eyes at each other, having responses. And so to me, that's an essential part of what the parables are doing. They're not the ending. They're the start of something.
As I think Dr. Carroll may be typing in some questions or working on his mic. You'd alluded earlier to just the question, I mean, where do you come down right now in terms of the parables in the framework of whatever you want to call it, historical Jesus studies? Like, you know, how have you addressed that in your recent book?
You know, I don't in that book. It's really a study of parables for churches. This paper is where I'm working on it more in the longer version of the paper. I think there's a lot of hope in recent historical Jesus research that talks about how memories develop in social groups and movements over time. And so that whereas in the 90s, people like Crossan we're trying to pick out the individual authentic things. What did Jesus really say? What did he really do? More recently, interpreters are looking for patterns in the gospel. How would Jesus have fit in his social context if he's remembered as a healer, if he's always at meals, if he's gathering disciples? And in this case, with the parables, not so much that individual parables can be pinpointed back to Jesus or parts of them, but that this idea, what I'm arguing in this presentation is, the gospel authors themselves perpetuate the memory of Jesus as an open-ended storyteller. They actually bring their literary artistry to bring it out. And Matthew and Luke do that independently, which is a sign that that is a way that Jesus may have made an impact and a memory on the movement that followed him. I see John Carroll's comment now. Is it, but I can't hear Sam.
Let's go to Dr. Carroll's comment in the chat, and then we have another question as well.
So if I may read it from chat, parables that engage readers, draw listeners in to finish the story, heighten the ethical responsibility of the audience interpreter. And John, I just want to sign on and endorse that. Right, we can do good or harm with how we use the Bible and the parables in particular. I think we could all imagine some harm that's done occasionally with the parables. But yes, the agency, our responsibility as interpreters is something we really need to own.
And then there's a question from Robert Stewart. Are you able to, so the question is, are you advocating a dialogical approach to preaching as opposed to a monological one? Traditional preaching tends to be a monologue.
And I happen to know Bob Stewart. He's a UCC pastor in this part of the world. Yes, I am. I'm advocating an approach to preaching. When I say you're using the word dialogical, Bob. I don't know necessarily if we mean the same thing by it, but I don't necessarily mean that there are multiple voices speaking out loud during the sermon. But what I do mean is that there are modes of preaching where, rather than talking about something to a group of people, we find ways of speaking that bring ourselves alongside a congregation. And you hear those moves, I think of it very strongly in some African American preaching traditions, where the preacher invites the congregation, don't you know what it's like? Have you had the experience of? Can you imagine yourself when? Those modes of preaching bring ourselves in a way down from the pulpit and into the midst of the people in a way that opens the space for them to begin doing that work. So that's what I would mean by dialogical, I think.
Other questions. Let's see. John has switched to Firefox. I think he's going to try again and see if he can have some exchange with you.
I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. I feel like there's probably a parable or maybe a miracle story about me. Well, Greg, I'm glad I do get to say something orally. So good to have this chance as it were, face to face. I've so appreciated your work, and I just picked up your little book on the short stories, and I'm looking forward to reading through it. I very much, I agree that to disentangle the creative work of the gospel authors who've delivered these, who've embedded these parables, who've delivered these parables to us, to disentangle their work from the generative work and voice of Jesus is probably historically not possible. And so what I'm wondering is, although I have to say, when I picked up John Mayer's book on the parables and went through this long, circuitous process that at the end of the day left us with no more than 4, I really wondered what the point of that inquiry was. If what we really need to do is dig in and seriously interpret the parables that we have. But I really appreciate the point that you've made about, I mean, what I'm talking about in terms of ethical responsibility, the ethics of the interpreters, and paying attention to the sources of the approaches that we're taking. I myself have been very much influenced by, scholars like Matthew Renge, who had a piece for interpretation, who emphasized the open-endedness of the parables. Michael Beth Dinkler and her work on the interior monologue within the Lucan parables in particular. So these are literary patterns that we encounter in the Gospels. I've looked especially closely at Luke. And I think that's there. If it's not from Jesus, if it's the creative work of the Gospel author, it's still there for us to reckon with. And so my point is to emphasize it really matters what we do with that. Whom are we bashing? Whom are we hurting? Whom are we wounding as we develop a response to a parable? I really found your work on Matthew 20, 1-16, very suggestive. That Matthew here is more provocative than Matthew's interpreters. And this reversal of status, it's not about equality. To ponder a world where being first means that we come in last. I think that's powerful, and I think it suggests the what we really can come away with as we grapple seriously with the details that are clearly placed there by Matthew, or in the case of Luke in the Lucan parables. They're just words of appreciation and really not points of significant disagreement tonight.
Well, I am interested in all of the reactions you might have, but I think the point about our responsibility as interpreters, whether it's scholars, in the academy, or preachers and teachers in the church, and I imagine we swap across those roles, all three of us. That there's something about the parables and our position in relation to them, of a disposition, if we can maintain a disposition of wonder or curiosity. I'm teaching an elective on the parables right now, and I'm having students fill out what I call parable observation worksheets, where I ask them just to describe, try not to layer on layers of interpretation, but just describe the dynamics or structure or context or the characters of the parable with some leading questions. And the whole idea is just, let's slow down. Let's slow down and pay close attention. I don't know. It seems to me we're in a world of trouble if we don't have that disposition of humility and wonder in front of these.
Yeah, really agree. Mm-hmm.
Are there? I feel like Dr. Carroll and I have monopolized the conversation. If for those of you who are out there, and we have quite a few folks watching, we don't want to extend this beyond its normal life, but I do want to allow a chance for if you can. If you can type questions in the Facebook feed or in the YouTube chat box, and they'll feed right into StreamYard. So we'll just pause for just a second and see if anybody has any questions before we call it a night. But this has been a really excellent and thought-provoking talk.
Let me while folks are getting courage up to pose a question, let me just ask you, Greg. Certainly, one of the Lucan parables is very open-ended. Is the father and the two sons in Luke 15? How do you think we're supposed to end that?
Oh wow! I mean, I think you could, if you agreed with the way I handled these other two parables, I bet you could write it out yourself, right? Mm-hmm. That Luke creates the scene. And so, you enter Luke 15, and again, to come back to our very first question, got scribes and Pharisees to talk about who are complaining about the company Jesus keeps. And then you get one parable that Luke shares with Matthew, and then two parables that are straight from Luke. And the parable of the prodigal has all these characteristics of Luke's parables. Yeah. And it ends coming back to resentment and being out. I just preached that parable yesterday to a Presbyterian congregation in Baltimore that is one of the more light congregations, and they invited me to talk about the LGBT issue. And the angle where I landed is churches are the ones standing outside missing the party at the end. In other words, I put the spotlight on the older brother because in my reading, I thought that's where Luke was putting the spotlight. And sort of flip the script on who's inside and who's outside. That, you know, there are so many of us in the church who are in a position of superiority and judging, and thereby are missing out on the gifts of the party that's available. So, I mean, that's an actual on the ground way that I work through that. But I'd be curious if you think the spotlight lands there. It's
yeah, I think that's great. I hadn't thought about that. So it's a way of conceiving the contemporary analog, but yeah, I mean, what distinguishes this third parable from the two that preceded it is precisely the role of the older son and his resistance. And so I think that is the point we're supposed to grapple with, and how are we? Who is being challenged, and how are we being challenged? Challenged by that. And just one other observation. You don't need to develop this, but I found another really interesting one. The next parable in Luke 16, beyond the one that you developed. So it's an open-ended story in terms of the five brothers. It's kind of a done deal for the rich man who's died and is in Hades. But the rich brothers, and in the logic, the rhetoric and the logic of the parable, there seems to be no hope for them. But if that's being pitched to the audience, and maybe a Lucan audience that has, some of them have some significant resources, you know, it does matter how they're going to end the story.
It sounds like we're reading Luke's audience in a similar way, that Luke has this sharp edge toward people who feel secure. At least, I mean, that's my reading. I have the impression that's yours. And I think that parable raises, I see that there's another question coming in, so I don't want to take too much time, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. To me, the eternal question with the parables is how far to push their details. Mm-hmm. You never know. I don't ever feel comfortable. No, I know when I've gone too far, or I hear something that's too far out there, but I can't find a rule for when to stop making something out of those details.
Okay, I have a really excellent question that will add some complexity, and I think will be of interest certainly to Dr. Carey. The question is from Roger Ginch: how does imperial criticism broaden the contextual considerations related to the parables beyond the Judaism-Christianity binary? I mean, so when we take into account imperial criticism, how does that make it even more complex?
Well, that is a great question. And so since I hadn't thought about it systematically, I'm going to wander for just a second in thinking about it. I think any language that we encounter in the Gospels in which we encounter king language or sometimes Lord language has the potential to resonate with imperial language, right? Because in a fundamental way among ancient Jews, to call God king is a way of judging other rulers. That's just implicit. I think that's there. I think you could add more layers, and you know, how do the Gospels deal with issues like patronage or honor or status? Those are there. I'm very much, because I work on Revelation, very much interested in the question of resistance. And yet at the same time, I imagine, and the way the Gospels look to me, that most ancient Galileans and Judeans weren't walking around thinking about the Romans all the time. In other words, they experienced empire at a remove that was real, and obviously resistance broke out and there were wars and all of that. But in your daily life, that wouldn't have been your preoccupation all the time. You didn't have CNN and Fox News to keep it going. And so I think that that there is, I'm not prone to read the parables primarily through an imperial lens, even though I think there are aspects of them that have implicit bearing on that. I don't necessarily need to have the last word on that. I don't feel super confident.
We've had some really good dissertations and conversations at Union on, some people have applied, James C. Scott's notion of hidden transcripts to some of the, not just the parables, but both New and Hebrew Bible passages. We've had Thea Portier Young come speak and talk about some of her work in this area of imperial criticism, or just in the imperial aspects of apocalyptic literature. But there's a really good question, I think, that takes us in a different direction, that comes from one of our alums who's doing a PhD right now, Chuck Crocker, who asks, what advice would you give to a pastor in a traditional conservative church to help the congregation think open-mindedly with open-ended parables?
And part of that question, I'm sorry, the first name again?
It's Chuck Crocker.
Chuck Crocker. Okay, thank you. Part of that question has to do with the traditions of preaching in those churches, which aren't what they used to be, right? It used to be that in conservative church, preachers tended to preach in a very didactic, here are the things, people would bring their notepad kind of way. And that's still happening. But in, the sort of non-denominational, more contemporary settings, more and more preachers are preaching alongside their congregation. So part of that would depend on the tradition of preaching people are used to, right? But I really do believe that the most effective way to, and I think about this a lot these days, as fractured as our society is, that the most effective way to help people move their imagines from one way to another is to, and I've said this a few times in other ways, is to join them and walk with them rather than talk at them and correct or condemn them, not to put them immediately on the defensive. And especially, you're their pastor anyway. So you want to honor that trust. So the preaching moves I would commend are the ones that invite curiosity. And just in the habits of preaching over time, it seems to me that process of opening curiosity is going to be more effective than simply trying to tell people how they need to think differently than they have. To me, one of the most effective phrases you can use in preaching these days is to say, I wonder. Do you wonder? That was a great question.
Yeah, that one, I really appreciate the great question, really thoughtful answer, and I like the I wonder especially. So we're coming to the end of our time, and so we have our an announcement related to next week's webinar. So I want to give our our awesome staff tonight a chance to just make sure that they have a minute to promo that. But I know all of you who are watching, and we had a wonderful crowd tonight. We had folks watching on our YouTube channel, on our various Facebook feeds, and so I checked once or twice to just see, and there was lively engagement on all of those platforms. So we have persevered during the pandemic, and really had it's really been a wonderful thing in certain respects, because it allows for alums and friends of the seminary and friends of Dr. Carey to participate, who wouldn't necessarily have been able to make the trip to Richmond. So we had over 50 folks on tonight, which is wonderful. So really glad about that. And So I think I know there's people in their kitchens and dining rooms and living rooms giving you applause, but Dr. Carroll and I will both offer our applause now, and I will turn it over. Crystal or Mike, do you want to mention the event next week at all?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Adams, and thank you for watching. Please join us again for our Just Talk, Talk Just panel discussion. Say Her Name, Womanist Theology, Activism, Movement Making. This webinar will be Tuesday, March 16th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Watch your email for registration. We hope you'll join us then. Have a great day.